So our first goal was to improve the standard of living. The second goal is economic growth. So economic growth is a positive change in the level of production of goods and services. So we're looking at the amount of goods and services that we make. So the previous goal was looking at the amount of goods and services we get to consume or enjoy. Now we're looking at the amount of goods and services we make. And so we're looking at, is the economy making more goods and services? But we need to know if we're making more goods and services per person. So we define economic growth as a change in real GDP per capita. So that per capita part is the per person. We divide it by the population. And then we're looking at gross domestic product. So gross domestic product is the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy, typically in a year's time. We look at it over a year. So we're looking at the total value of all the goods and services we make in a year, and we do that per person. Now, we'll talk about later this semester why we look at just final goods and services. What that final refers to is that we capture the value of the car, not the seats and the car, because that would be double counting. Because when you sell the car, it includes all the pieces inside of it, including the seats. So we're looking at the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a year, and we look at it per person. The reason we look at it per person is what happens if you have a population boom, but you're not making more goods and services. So the population grows faster than your GDP. Well, then your economy's not really growing because you're not making more per person. We're not getting more stuff made and therefore more stuff consumed. So we look at it per person. And then we also look at it in terms of real terms. And that real means we take out inflation. Because we want to look at the total amount of goods and services we're making, but the problem is it's hard to add one pencil plus one laptop plus one car, right? So instead we add them up based on their value. But because we really care about the number of goods and services that are produced, we want to take out inflation. Because we don't want to think our economy is growing, and really all it is that everything got more expensive. So we're looking at real GDP per capita. So we're going to take out inflation, and we'll look later this semester about how you do that. How do you take out inflation? We're also going to look later this semester at how you calculate GDP. But right now, we just want to know what is happening with our gross domestic product, and is our economy growing? So before we dive into what's happening right now, let's look at how do we get economic growth. So how do we get that change in real GDP per capita? All right, so let's see if we can't get our slides to go forward here. So really there's two ways to increase or change. So we're going to use the symbol here. This triangle is the symbol delta, and it just means change. So we're looking for the change in real GDP per capita. So how do we make more stuff per person? Well, one way is to increase your labor force. That is, if we have more workers, we can make more stuff. The other option is to increase productivity. That is, we get more from each worker. Okay. So the same amount of workers, but each one is making more. So we want to look at what's happening this semester as we look at what's happening with our labor force. So how many workers do we have in Canada and what's been happening to them? We also want to look at the productivity per worker. So how much does the typical worker produce in terms of the value of the goods and services, and is that productivity increasing? Because if we get more goods produced per worker, then our economy is growing. Now, the challenge with measuring economic growth by looking at real GDP per capita is that it doesn't capture all economic output. So later this semester, as we dive into GDP and how it's measured, we're going to learn that there's a number of things not included in GDP. And that's because the way we measure GDP is based on data that's reported to the government. So when we pay our taxes, we're reporting information to the government, and we use that to help measure the size of the economy. So if we don't report it in our taxes, then the government doesn't know that it's happening, right? So any kind of illegal or black market, okay, so if we make and sell drugs, well, we're not reporting it to Revenue Canada, we're not reporting it to the government. And so even though it is a good that is produced and has value to people, it is not included in GDP, and it doesn't then get included in the measure of the size of the economy. When you do things like housework, okay, when you're babysitting for a family friend, so cash under the table, or where you're providing a service but you're not getting paid and reporting it on your taxes, that does have value. It is a good or a service that's created, but because you're not reporting it to Revenue Canada, it's not included in GDP. So even though you provide a value to your family by cleaning the house, it's not included. If you had hired a service to clean your house, that would be included in GDP because that does get reported to Revenue Canada. As well, the sale of used goods. So garage sales, selling your car, those are not included in gross domestic product. And we'll look into more of that later this semester. So there's a challenge with measuring the size of the economy with our real GDP per capita, but we have a method to try to estimate the size of the economy to see if our economy is growing. Now, the challenge though is that just because we are making more goods and services doesn't necessarily mean that our economy is doing great, because we don't take into consideration the impact on pollution, depletion of resources, traffic congestion. So think about it. We're all working, right? Economy is booming because we all have jobs. Well, we could all be producing lots of goods, but creating a lot of pollution. So the air outside is toxic. We spend hours in our cars trying to get to these jobs. It's a huge amount of traffic congestion. What we produce could be strip mining the land, plowing down all the trees, and making it a barren wasteland. It could be super noisy. It could be very stressful. So when we measure economic growth just based on the value of the goods and services we make, it doesn't take into consideration all those external impacts that we could have on the environment or on our lives. So we have to take that into consideration. So just having tons of economic growth isn't necessarily the best thing because it could have these impacts on the environment and life as well. So we have to take that into consideration. All right, so if we're measuring economic growth based on the value of the goods and services we produce, the question is, how big is our economy and are we growing? So where do we currently stand when it comes to our gross domestic product? So we can see here over time, we go back to the 1920s up until now, and for the most part, we see economic growth over time. These little dips that you see, these are recessions, downturns when the economy contracts, when the economic growth. But for the most part, over time, we have growth. We can more detail here. So what you're seeing here is just the growth rate, that long-term upward trend. And then we can start to see, here's the 2008 recession, okay, often called the Great Recession, and because of its, and you can see we also had recessionary periods in the 80s and the 90s. So we want to know, is our economy growing? That is, are we making more goods and services? Periods we're making less goods and services. Here we can see for in 2016 the economies that were growing, and we can see the economies that were growing the slowest. Okay, what economic growth in Canada? Our growth rate tends to be about percent a year. That tends to be where we are. So to give you a bit of a comparison, and we can actually to a website like Trading Economics, which you learned about in the previous level, and the growth rates of different countries. So we could say, okay, how about Canada? And growth rate of 0.9% over time, that growth in Canada. And let's just go back. So that one is quarterly, but typically what we do is we look at a year over time, so you can see those growth rates, right? 1 to 2% a year. You can use Trading Economics to go and find other countries. And you can look at the United States, you can look at their growth rates, and so they're growing 2 to 3%. Most larger, stable, growing 2 to 3% per year is the typical rate. It's quite unusual to be growing at 5% unless you are a smaller economy that is seeing great transition. So becoming an industrialized nation, right? You're starting to see the emergence of a middle class, great increases in technology. Those are things that bigger economic growth. Well, what has been happening to our economic growth over time? We said, really we see about, 1, sometimes 3% growth for our country. Now we said the two sources of economic growth were an increase in the labor force, so more workers, increase in productivity. Okay, well, how do you get more workers? Well, one way to get more workers is to have, when it comes to immigration, so bring more people in or have more babies so that your population will grow and you'll have more workers. So that's one way for us to get economic growth. The other is to increase workers. Now, what you see here on the right is labor productivity over the years. And the big challenge we've had with labor productivity over the years in Canada is it's been extremely. The World Trade Organization, the Bank of Canada, they've all warned that the biggest risk to economic growth for Canada is lack of increase in productivity. We're not getting more per worker. Per worker really hasn't changed in decades. So what per worker? Well, here you can see the productivity per worker in international dollars. So the Canada makes about $86,000 worth of goods and services. Now, that in international dollars, the income per work was, what was that? It was that about $46,000 or so. That we don't get paid, our income is not the same as the productivity per worker. Twice as much in terms of the value of the goods and services you produce as opposed to what you get paid, right? Because of course we have to have profit to have overhead costs, and so all the money from the goods and services you make doesn't go to you, the worker. That productivity per worker to other countries. So the typical worker in Mexico makes about worth of goods. A typical worker in the United States makes about $115,000 worth. So how come the productivity of Canadians isn't as high as those states? Well, here is the productivity per worker for many other countries. It was actually taken from the Scottish government, which is why Scotland is dark here. But we can see Canada. So let's look at the countries that have higher productivity per worker and those that have lower. Your lower productivity per worker if you primarily harvest resources in countries. So if your primary production is oil, is lumber, and you sell it to another country, the value of what you're selling is low. You take resources and combine them into finished products. Okay, so think of like creation of like an iPhone, right? So if you're that is digging up the rare earth mineral, then the value added is low. But if you're the one selling the finished product of the iPhone, a lot more value added in terms of the amount of the price. And so you tend to, the countries that you see here on the far left tend to make more finished products, and with the lower productivity per worker tend to mostly make raw materials. Productivity per worker, there's one more thing I want to show you, and that is this in productivity. So we had a recession in 2008 and the Great Recession. Now, what happens when there's a recession is, right, you're concerned that people aren't buying your product, you don't need as many workers because you're not going to make as many products. So you lay people off, you downsize. Well, as the economy starts to turn around, companies don't immediately go and hire more people, right? You're kind of cautious. You're what's going to happen. So what happens as the demand increases for your products is that initially you're going to do more. You're going to have them work extra hours or overtime. They're going to work too. And after that's stable, that increase in demand, you're going to hire more workers, which means you don't need as much from a single worker. So we tend to see these spikes after recessions because we are asking more from our worker. That productivity falls back to kind of where it was before. Now, as we're looking at value from our workers, who do you think, I'll get to that later. I was going to ask you, who do you think are the biggest employers in the country or in the world, but we'll get to that in our section on employment. So next video, when we talk about the goal of full employment.